Hi, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you're joining us from. We'll give everyone a moment or two to come into the virtual room before we get started. I can see the room filling up. It's always fun to see the numbers pouring in and the participant number going up. So in the interest of time, I will get started. So let me officially say hello. Welcome, everyone, to our virtual event, Clean Hydrogen, Leveraging Bilateral Opportunities in Canada and Japan. Bonjour, bienvenue, konnichiwa. My name is Elizabeth Shirt, and I will be your MC for this two-day event. I'm the managing director of Globe Series, and my organization had the privilege of supporting the governments of Canada and Japan in organizing today's event. Today's event is trilingual, and you're able to follow along in English, French, and Japanese. At the bottom of your screen, there's a language button that looks like a globe. Click on this to change your language. Pour ajuster votre langue au français, cliquez sur l'icône représentant un globe en bas de votre écran. Gengo o Nihon o ni suru ni wa gamen kabu no globu button o kiriku shite kudasai. I apologize for my Japanese, but I do want to make sure everyone knows how to locate that button at the bottom. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you as part of this event, including ministers and vice ministers, leading hydrogen experts, private sector entrepreneurs and investors, and community and Indigenous leaders from around the world. However, before we begin, I believe it's important to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Canada, from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, also known as Vancouver. To our international audience, the act of acknowledging the land and the signed treaties where applicable is an act of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada, and it's an expression of respect and of gratitude for the land. This action is to remind us that the places of our work, where we live and where we gather are on the traditional lands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who historically resided here and still do today. It's also a recognition that all of us are accountable to these relationships on a daily basis. So I would encourage you to take a moment and consider your connection to the land from which you're joining our event today, and get using that chat box and sharing with the group where you're joining from, your connection to the land, a land acknowledgement if you feel comfortable, and of course, all languages are welcome. Today's event is day one of 2 days. Today, we'll focus on policies and partnerships. We'll hear about the leadership of the governments of Canada and Japan on clean hydrogen, and we'll explore opportunities for Canada-Japan collaboration. Tomorrow, we'll focus on innovation, markets, and trade by tapping into Canada and Japan's hydrogen market potential and showcasing some of the exciting innovations that are already out there. We'll also offer networking activities at the end of both days, so please be sure to stick around until the end. One of our key objectives for this event is to bring together key actors across different sectors of industry, government, and academia to focus on opportunities and challenges for Canada-Japan cooperation and trade in the area of clean hydrogen. Taking this broad-based approach, our hope is that the discussion over the next 2 days will be a catalyst for further discussions between companies, investors, experts, and policymakers on both sides of the Pacific. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first distinguished speaker, the Honorable Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Minister Wilkinson wishes that he could have joined us live today, but unfortunately his schedule couldn't allow for it. However, one of the benefits of the virtual world we're living in is the opportunity to be in 2 places at once. So it's our pleasure to share with you these pre-recorded remarks from Minister Wilkinson, and he's pleased to be able to share this virtual podium with Parliamentary Vice Minister of Environment, the Honourable Miyazaki Masuru. Let's hear first from Minister Wilkinson.
Hello, everyone. As is our custom in Canada, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from my home community of North Vancouver, British Columbia, which is on the traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. My thanks to the Japanese Ministry of the Environment for co-hosting this event with Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the Globe Series for helping to organize this. It is certainly a pleasure to be sharing the virtual podium. We are here today because we recognize the urgent need to accelerate global climate action and collaboration toward achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Today's webinar touches on a key emerging and promising technology or set of technologies with potential to play a significant role. I am a firm believer that hydrogen will be a pillar of a new, cleaner, and more prosperous way forward for our global community. The hydrogen space is of great interest to me personally. Before entering politics, I worked in the clean technology sector, including as the chief executive officer of a hydrogen technology company. In fact, the company of which I was the CEO did substantial business in Japan, working with strategic partners, including MKK, a subsidiary of Mitsubishi, and Iwatani on a number of hydrogen-related initiatives. Last November, the Government of Canada tabled the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. This act commits Canada in law to reaching net zero by 2050 and requires emissions reductions targets and plans at 5-year intervals. To support achievement of these targets, in December, the Prime Minister of Canada and I launched Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan, which we called A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. The plan includes $15 billion in new investments, bringing the government's total committed funding for climate change and clean growth to almost $100 billion since 2017. Canada's climate plan contains 64 additional measures, which will enable Canada to exceed its current 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target under the Paris Agreement and put us well on the road towards a net zero future by 2050. More recently, Canada has committed to bringing forward an enhanced target to the Earth Summit in Washington next month. In December, Canada also released its hydrogen strategy, which underlines that by 2050, clean hydrogen can help Canada achieve our net zero goal while creating jobs, growing our economy, and protecting our environment. As one of the top 10 hydrogen producers in the world, Canada has all the key ingredients to develop a competitive and sustainable hydrogen economy. From rich feedstocks for producing net zero hydrogen to world-leading innovation in areas such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology, and an experienced energy industry, Canada is strongly interested in the development of pathways for both green and blue hydrogen. If Canada fully capitalizes on its advantages, by 2050, the use of hydrogen can reduce emissions by up to 30% of end-use energy while improving air quality across this country. And as an energy-rich nation with significant clean hydrogen production capacity, established international trade partnerships, including with Japan, and strategic infrastructure assets such as deep-water ports and established pipeline networks, Canada is well positioned to become a top global supplier of clean hydrogen. Japan has also been a leader in hydrogen for use in heavy industry, but also in areas such as transportation, where Toyota in particular has been a significant technology leader. I believe cooperation and collaboration between our nations in the hydrogen field would be highly productive for both parties. Canada is very much ready to be at the forefront of the global hydrogen economy, working with thoughtful partners like Japan. I am very keen to see how we can partner on specific areas to accelerate environmental and economic progress. My hope is that this webinar is just the beginning of many more such discussions and much more collaboration between Canada and Japan, and I very much look forward to seeing the positive outcomes in bilateral trade, investment, innovation, and cooperation on clean hydrogen. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. I want to take a moment just to acknowledge the number of attendees and the diverse geographies that we're seeing folks join today. We had over 600 registrants for today's event. I'm seeing almost 300 on the line now on day one. And we know we had individuals register from Canada, coast to coast, from Japan, various regions, as well as from the US, the UK, India, Germany, Bangladesh. So we have a very diverse international group joining, and I see you and I encourage you to continue to use the chat to share where you're joining from, share that connection to the land that you might feel, and just say hello to your colleagues. And feel free to use the chat throughout the event today to interact, yes, with the speakers, but also with each other, because this is about bringing a group together in bilateral and, of course, a multilateral conversation on how we can leverage these opportunities. So thank you again to Minister Wilkinson for joining us by video. It's now my pleasure to introduce Parliamentary Vice Minister of Environment in Japan, Miyazaki Masudu, also joining us today via pre-recorded video. So I'm thrilled to hand over to the Vice Minister.
カナダの皆さん、こんばんは。日本の皆さん、おはようございます。ただいまご紹介に預かりました環境大臣政務官の宮崎勝でございます。本日は帰国との水素の利活用に関するオンラインシンポジウムにご招待いただき誠にありがとうございます。さて、昨今の異常気象、災害など気候変動による影響が顕在化する中、世界的にカーボンニュートラルな社会への変革が求められており、我が国は2020年10月に2050年カーボンニュートラル脱炭素社会の実現を目指すことを宣言いたしました。これに合わせて菅総理は、もはや温暖化への対応は経済成長の制約ではない、積極的に温暖化対策を行うことが産業構造や経済社会の変革をもたらし、大きな成長につながると述べられました。すなわち、カーボンニュートラルは日本の新たな成長戦略となっています。この2050年カーボンニュートラルの実現に向けては、2030年までの10年が勝負であり、非連続なイノベーションを通じた環境と成長の好循環が必要です。環境省としては、水素をはじめとするイノベーションの推進とともに、地域における国民・生活者目線での脱炭素社会実現に向けたロードマップの策定などを目指す国・地方脱炭素実現会議の開催やカーボンプライシングの検討などを行っています。その中でも水素は脱炭素社会の実現に向けて重要な鍵となるものです。このような認識のもと、環境省では地域の再エネなどから水素を作り、地域で使うというサプライチェーン構築実証事業を国内10カ所で進めています。例えば、再エネ由来の水素を既存の物流網で一緒に届けるといった日常生活に水素の活用を取り込んだ脱炭素な水素ライフスタイルの実現に向けた取り組みを先行的に進めているほか、2011年に発生した東日本大震災で甚大な被害を受けた福島県において、再エネ由来の水素を活用した脱炭素な形での復興プロジェクトにも着手しています。また、水素はサーキュラーエコノミー実現にも貢献すると考えています。使用済みプラスチックから水素を製造する事業、廃棄物処理施設から分離回収した CO2 と水素を活用し、メタンやエタノールといった燃料、プラスチック原料などを製造する事業も進めています。このほか、燃料電池バス、燃料電池フォークリフト、燃料電池船などの技術開発や導入支援も行っています。これら水素の利活用の推進にあたっては、さまざまなステークホルダーの協力や知見が不可欠であると考えております。今回のシンポジウムで、両国政府、 企業の活発な意見交換がなされることを期待しています。そして両国の脱炭素社会、水素社会の実現に向けた取り組みの加速化のきっかけになることを記念しまして、私からの挨拶とさせていただきます。本日はよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much, Vice Minister. I know we experienced just a little bit of technical challenge there with the interpretation with the video. It seemed that the original audio wasn't muted, so our apologies for that. When we do have the live speakers, that function should be working. So we'll ensure that that is easier to follow. But thank you, Vice Minister, for joining us. I'd now like to allow all of you to share a little bit about yourselves before we jump into the next part of the program. So in just a moment, you'll see a poll appearing on your screen. You should see that appear in English, as well as in French and Japanese in the slide behind. When that poll appears, note that you can drag and move that poll pop-up so you're able to read the slide that's showing in behind, so you can read the poll questions in your language of choice. You'll have 30 to 45 seconds here to reply. What we're hoping to understand is why you're joining us today. So feel free to pick all options that apply. Are you joining to learn about the hydrogen strategies of Canada and Japan? Are you joining to better understand market opportunities for hydrogen trade and investment in both Canada and Japan? Are you joining to learn about key policy, technical, cross-cultural, and other challenges for bilateral cooperation on hydrogen in Canada and Japan? Or is it to meet and interact with other hydrogen and clean tech companies in Canada and Japan? So please make your selections. As I said, you can move that poll window in order to be able to view in the language of your choice. I'm going to choose mine and submit. And in just a moment here, we'll show you the results so you can get a feel for your colleagues who are on the line and their interests in being a part of our event today. Great. So a diversity of interests we're seeing at the top to learn about hydrogen strategies in both Canada and Japan, but also lots of interest in other areas, including market opportunities for trade, key policy, technical and other challenges or barriers, and of course, to meet and interact with other colleagues on these issues. Great, thanks for participating in that. I'd now like to move on to the next portion of our agenda, where we'll be looking to a clean hydrogen future with an overview of the hydrogen strategies of Canada and Japan. During this section, we'll get to hear from leaders in Canada and Japan respectively as they share more on their government's hydrogen strategies. We will have some time at the end for questions from the audience, so please add them into the chat as you're listening to our speakers so we can make sure to address those. To start, I'd first like to welcome Aaron Hoskin, Senior Manager, Low Carbon Energy Sector at Natural Resources Canada. Aaron, thanks for joining, and over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this panel and to this session, the two-day session. It's really amazing to be here. Before I start my presentation, hopefully the slides can be loaded up. I do want to acknowledge that I am here in Ottawa, Canada, Canada's capital, but I am on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin First Nation. So Canada's hydrogen strategy, the hydrogen strategy for Canada, as well as opportunities to collaborate with Japan. That's kind of where the presentation will go. Next slide, please. This is really a culmination of more than 3 years of analysis. We started down this road 3 years ago. We launched the strategy, as Minister Wilkinson said, in mid-December. Today, I'll just talk about the advantages that the strategy identifies, the opportunities, the key findings of the strategy, remaining challenges, targeted recommendations, and then opportunities for international collaboration. Next slide, please. So Canada's advantages, as Minister Wilkinson mentioned, we have a number of different advantages. If you think about all of the different production pathways for hydrogen, we do have pretty much every mechanism to produce clean hydrogen. We have one of the lowest emitting electricity grids in the world, strong renewable capacity and growing renewable capacity, vast conventional energy resources, which can be converted to very low carbon hydrogen with carbon abatement. We are also a world leader in carbon abatement and CCUS technologies, and we're a tier 1 nuclear nuclear country. Leading innovation, we have leading companies that are exporting around the world. We have global IP leadership. I would say Canada and Japan are there. We have very strong federal labs as well that can partner with labs around the world to continue to push innovation as we go forward. We have a strong energy sector. Again, Minister Wilkinson flagged this as well. We have more than 900,000 direct and indirect jobs related to the energy sector. We're exporting our energy products around the world, including LNG to Japan. We have invested more than $600 billion in investment, extensive infrastructure, natural gas infrastructure across the country, which we know can be used to transport hydrogen in different blend levels across the country as well. And then we are a tier 1 nuclear country, as I said. We have international collaboration. We've been collaborating around the world for more than 40 years through things like the International Partnership for Hydrogen Fuel Cells in the Economy, through the International Energy Agency, through the Japan Hydrogen Energy Ministerial, and congratulations on Japan for launching that 3 years ago. It was really part of the big push towards global deployment of hydrogen. And then also more recently, Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, the European Union, and the United States launched a clean energy ministerial hydrogen initiative as well. So long history of collaborating internationally on hydrogen as well. We have access to export markets on both the East Coast, the West Coast, and into the United States. We can transport hydrogen across the Atlantic into Europe. We do know that we are closer to Japan and Korea than other markets, and we have opportunities for very large-scale clean hydrogen production. And we have a unique starting point. I like to say the hydrogen story is a Canadian story. More than 100 years ago, our companies had issued the first patent for large-scale hydrogen production, and we continue to ride that wave of being world's first, along with Japanese companies in terms of hydrogen deployment as well. World's first bus fleets, world's first vehicle fleets, and we continue to do so. Next slide, please. Canada has opportunities across the entire country. As I mentioned, we are a vast country, but there's opportunities for clean production and end use across the country in different timing and different priorities, but there are opportunities even in Canada's north, on the East Coast and the West Coast, opportunities in marine, in rail, in mining, in blending with natural gas to decarbonize our natural gas system, in energy storage, long-term energy storage, in industrial processes. And we've really looked to Japan to learn more about how you're using hydrogen in your industrial processes as well. Next slide. So key findings, I mentioned this is 3 years of work. It did culminate in a series of 15 targeted stakeholder engagement sessions that we held over the summer. We spoke to more than 1,500 individuals from about 280 organizations, and we heard loud and clear through all of these consultations a number of key findings. Global momentum is growing. I don't think I need to talk about that. We have more than 300 participants on this call, for instance. We have significant opportunities both domestically and internationally. Actions are going to be sort of a combination of both these hubs that bring together multi-stakeholders from across the value chain, so producers, end users, as well as large-scale signature projects, which can be highlighted internationally. Our strategy is not just domestic focus, it also is about how Canada can become that supplier of choice to the world for clean hydrogen and the technologies that use it. And so we heard that the best way to grow and seize that export potential, a market that's expected to reach $11.7 trillion by 2050, is to grow the domestic deployment as well. And so we know that both need to happen. The focus needs to be on carbon intensity. Minister Wilkinson mentioned this as well, as opposed to looking at green or brown or blue or pink or yellow, all the different colors of hydrogen production. What really is important is the carbon intensity of the hydrogen. The pathway shouldn't matter as long as that carbon intensity is low and driven towards zero over time. And that's what the strategy in Canada is really focused on. Environmental benefits, if we seize the full opportunity for hydrogen that hydrogen presents, hydrogen could make up to 30% of Canada's energy mix by 2030. That's 190 megatons of CO2 reduction. 30%, so that means that Canada's economy will be powered by two main things in a net zero future: electrification, clean electricity, and clean fuels, including hydrogen. If we reach that 30% target, that means economic benefits of about 350,000 hydrogen sector jobs, more than 50 billion in domestic revenue, 50 billion in exports, although I'd say that's significantly conservative, 5 million fuel cell vehicles, and a national refueling network. Next slide, please. We do know there's remaining challenges. This should not be new to anyone. Economics in terms of the upfront cost differential between hydrogen technologies and conventional technologies. Innovation, the best way to reduce that price point differential is through continued sustained support for innovation. There's a need for long-term policy signals, and there was lacking, although, you know, more recently, as Minister Wilkinson mentioned as well, Canada's strengthened climate plan, so our path to exceeding our 2030 targets and putting us on a firm foundation to being net zero by 2050, hydrogen plays a key role there. There's gaps in existing codes and standards for things like hydrogen blending, for instance. Availability, you cannot grow domestic deployment unless you have a supply of clean hydrogen. Similarly, you're not going to grow clean hydrogen production unless you have a market into which you can sell it. So the two need to grow together. And then there's just a lack of awareness from everyday populations, Canadian citizens, not just being aware of hydrogen or thinking, you know, what they see in Hollywood is what hydrogen actually is, up to and including end users understanding the long-term sustainability opportunities that hydrogen presents. Next slide. So those gaps or those barriers or challenges led us to putting forward a series of 32 recommendations structured under 8 thematics in the strategy itself. Things like strategic partnerships. This is government and governments. So federal government working with subnational governments, the provinces and territories, working internationally, working with private sector stakeholders, Indigenous communities and organizations, everyone working together. That's the best way to grow deployment. De-risking investments. This does not come cheap. We do know that energy transition and transformation does cost. And so there's a need to de-risk those upfront investments. There's a need to continue to work on codes and standards, a need to continue to have innovation to ensure that Canadian companies remain at the forefront of innovation in this sphere. The need for enabling policies and regulations, several recommendations related to awareness, everything from building public confidence in fuel cell buses or hydrogen in general, up to and including helping businesses understand the value proposition. So working with businesses or with sectors of the economy to do that price point calculation of, if we adopt hydrogen now, what does that mean for our long-term sustainability? International markets, as I said, Canada's strategy is not just domestic focused, it's how can we build off things like today, or just at the beginning of the week, actually, Canada and Germany had a similar workshop, and we really continue to identify those areas where Canada can be the supplier of choice for clean hydrogen and the technologies to use it. And that happens through international growth as well. And then regional blueprints. Our country is vast and diverse and not very dense. And so there are opportunities for production energies across the country, but those opportunities differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so we're complementing the strategy for the entire country with a series of regional blueprints at the subnational level. Minister Wilkinson mentioned Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan had $15 billion in investments total. 1.5 billion of that is to grow the domestic clean fuels market, including early actions outlined in the strategy. And so we see some early actions happening on all of these recommendations. Next slide, please. So just a quick snapshot of what Canada's, what 2050 could look like in Canada if we seize that 30% potential. I spoke about all of these numbers earlier. It's 190 megatons. It's 20 megatons of very low carbon intensity hydrogen. Although we do know that there was just a study released on Monday that suggested Canada could export upwards of 25 to 35 megatons of clean hydrogen as well. And so there's significant opportunity to grow clean production across the country. One of the top 3 producers of clean hydrogen globally, and then again exporting globally as well, 350,000 jobs, and that ubiquitous, diverse transportation system as well. Next slide. So 2 more slides and then I'll end. So I mentioned Canada is already working internationally. I just wanted to flag that we are working through things like the Clean Energy Ministerial. Canada and Japan are already collaborating on the Clean Energy Ministerial, and this complements the Japan Hydrogen Energy Ministerial that happens as well. So this is ensuring that hydrogen stays on the radar of energy ministers across the country, across the globe, basically. We have more than 20 countries that are members. Canada, Japan, the European Union, the United States, and Netherlands are co-chairs of this, and it opens that opportunity to be that pillar, that cornerstone of global deployment. Next slide, please. specific activities that we're working on, things like ports, hydrogen use in ports, transportation, medium and heavy, rail, marine, industrial sectors, sustainable finance. What does that look like in hydrogen? We had 2 webinars on hydrogen and nuclear and the nexus between both, and we will continue to have biannual reports. And this international initiative really complements, as I've mentioned, work undertaken under the IPHE and the Japan Hydrogen Energy Ministerial as well. A key part there is that certification of hydrogen. We are working internationally to develop a common methodology to determine the carbon intensity of hydrogen so that we can get away from colors and really focus on the important factor, which is how do you determine the carbon intensity and how can we focus on that so that as hydrogen becomes that globally traded commodity, it's really about looking at the carbon intensity of the product as opposed to whether or not it was produced via nuclear or wind or solar or conventional production using carbon abatement. Next slide, please. And with that, I will end the session and pass it over back to Elizabeth. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hoskin. What a great overview of some of the opportunities, some of the challenges, and the steps that Canadian government is looking to take with respect to those. I'd now like to hand over to Mr. Kato Se, head of the Climate Change Projects Office in the Climate Change Policy Division of the Global Environment Bureau, part of the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. Mr. Kato, over to you for your presentation.
はい、ご紹介ありがとうございます。日本の環境省の加藤でございます。声聞こえておりますでしょうか。
Yes, we hear you well. Thank you.
はい、では始めさせていただきます。日本から参加の皆様おはようございます。カナダでご参加の皆様、ディナータイムに恐縮です。こんばんは。本日のウェビナー、準備いただいた皆様、大変ありがとうございます。大変クリアに会議、ウェビナーが進められているかと思います。また、参加の皆様に関しましては、朝早く、もしくは夕方、夜遅くということになりますが、実り大きいウェビナーになることをお祈りしております。また、ホスキンさんにおかれましては、素晴らしいプレゼンテーションありがとうございました。日本側からは、日本の環境省、もしくは経済産業省からですね、まず前半、環境省からは、日本の気候変動政策と、環境省における水素プロジェクトの状況についてご説明をさせていただきたいと思います。その後、経済産業省さんからプレゼンをいただくと、こういうことになっております。よろしくお願いいたします。次のスライドをお願いします。私も変えられるのかな。ありがとうございます。まず、日本の環境省として今取り組んでおりますのは、先ほどもご説明ございましたとおり、水素の需要を増やしていかないといけないということございますので、水素燃料電池フォークリフトやバスなどの開発を、環境省として行っております。で、それ以外、燃料電池と水素を組み合わせて、短期の貯蔵も、長期の貯蔵もできるようなシステム、蓄電水素活用システム、こういうものについての支援、こういうものを行っているというところでございます。で、そういうものをできるだけカーボンニュートラルな形、グリーンな形で行うということで、地域の資源を活用してということで、リニューアブルエナジーや牛の糞、もしくは廃プラスチック、このようなものを利用して水素を作るということによって、地域で自立分散型の脱炭素社会、こういうものを作って、サステナブルな地域を作っていくという取り組みを行っているところでございます。次お願いします。環境省の方で今10地域で、モデルプロジェクトを実施しておりまして、北海道、カナダに似たようなところの地域では、例えば牛の糞などを利用して、 水素を活用する事業というものを行っておりますし、先ほど宮崎政務官からもございました通り、東日本大震災で被害を受けた宮城や福島、この辺りで水素急増合金を活用して生活者に密着した水素のデリバリーというものができないかというような実証を行っております。また都市部の川崎のようなエリアにつきましては、廃プラスチック、これを集めて水素として利用するというような取り組みを行っているところでございます。一番西側に来まして、北九州のようなところにつきましては、ウィンドファームと、廃棄物発電、こういうものを組み合わせて水素の利活用ができないかというようなことの実証を行っているということでございます。次、お願いします。日本もですね、政府全体として、昨年の10月に、菅総理が2050年までのカーボンニュートラル、脱炭素社会を目指すということを宣言されておりまして、この宣言の内容に基づいて、新しいその成長戦略として、カーボンニュートラル、どのようなその道筋を描いていくかということを政府全体として検討をしているということでございます。次、お願いします。そのために、一つは、国よりも動きが早い、サブナショナルである自治体の取り組みをエンハンスすると、加速化させるということが必要でございますので、ゼロカーボンシティというものを各地方自治体に宣言していただいているところでございまして、今300以上の自治体、人口規模にして1億人以上の自治体の方にゼロカーボンシティを目指すということで宣言をいただいているところでございます。で、その内容、その宣言を実際のものにして、加速化していく取り組みとして、緑色のボックス一番上のところですが、国地方脱炭素実現会議というものを、昨年12月から開催しておりまして、2回目を4月中旬、3回目を5月ということで、その内容をロードマップの形でまとめていくということを進めているところでございます。また2つ目の赤いボックスのところにございます通り、環境省、経済産業省で連携しまして、カーボンプライシングの検討をしております。成長につながるカーボンプライシングというものを両省で検討するというようにということで、菅総理からご指示をいただいて、今、両省で連携して検討を進めているところでございます。この検討内容によって、水素の利用が加速化される、後押しされると、相対的に有利になるという環境をどうやって作っていけるかということが重要というふうに考えております。3つ目のボックスのところが、地球温暖化対策法という法律の改正案を政府として提出しておりまして、今後、国会で審議をいただくということになっております。先ほどウィルキンソン環境大臣からもカナダで2050年カーボンニュートラルを法律に位置づけているというお話がございましたが、日本も同様にこの法律の中で2050年カーボンニュートラルというものを位置づけるということを目指しております。また、そのビルディングブロックとして、再生可能エネルギーの普及を促進するというようなスキームをこの法律の中に位置づけるという予定としております。で、そのようなものを積み上げていきまして、地球温暖化対策計画、エネルギー基本計画、長期の脱炭素の戦略、このようなものを国内で今後 COP26 に向けてまとめていくということにしております。でその中で、2050年カーボンニュートラルに整合した、野心的な2030年の目標というものも定め、 NDC として UNFCCC に提出していくという予定としております。次が最後ですね。私のプレゼンは以上でございます。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Kato. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Fujioka Leosuke, Assistant Director of Advanced Energy Systems and Structure Division in the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Department, part of the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy. Over to you, Mr. Fujioka, for the next part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth-san. Hello, everybody. My name is Ryosuke Fujioka. I'm now working at the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Strategy Office in Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, Japan. Previously, I was working at the International Affairs Divisions, and I tried to enhance the bilateral collaboration with Canada, with the NRCan and teams with Jay Kosura-san. So I'm really happy to come back here to start our new collaborations around hydrogens. So today's my presentation's title is Japan's hydrogen strategy, but actually Japan has kind of two strategies related to hydrogen at this moment. So I would like to explain a little bit in detail about these two strategies. Can you move on to the next slide? So Japan is really try hard to attain the hydrogen society, and there is several related documents around hydrogens. And one of the most important document is Basic Energy Plan. This one is comprehensive government strategy and guiding principle we will follow. And hydrogens is positioned as a key contributors to the decarbonization and energy security and industrial competitiveness. But we focusing dedicatedly on the hydrogen at the basic hydrogen strategy, which was drafted in 2017. And this one is the first comprehensive national strategy in the world. And we try to position hydrogen as the future energy options towards 2050. And we have a very specific numerical target, including costs. And can you move on to the next slide? And let me deeply introduce this one a little bit more. And there is three conditions for the realizing the affordable hydrogens. So we have to utilize the inexpensive feedstock, such as unused resources and renewables. I mean, excess amount of renewables. And we try to develop the large-scale H2 supply chains. So as you may know, so Japan has a limited natural resources domestically. So we have to carry some of the hydrogens from the foreign countries, including Canada to some extent. So we are now investing very hard in some of the transportation technologies overseas. And demand side is also crucial. So we try to create the massive demand from the mobility sector to the power generation sectors. And everybody might assume that renewable energy and some other domestic resources can fill almost all of the power demand in every countries. But unfortunately, Japan is not the case. So we are trying to introduce massive amount of hydrogens in the generation sector. And there are three key technologies to be developed. And one is production. And we are now doing some of the demonstration project in the electrolysis system and coal gasification systems plus CCS. And when it comes to the transportations, we are trying to seek which carrier is the best one. And there's a multiple carrier, as you may know. One is liquid hydrogen, and MCH is kind of a chemical carrier of hydrogen. And some ammonia can play a role in transporting hydrogens. And regarding usages, we are putting emphasis on the fuel cells at this moment. And Toyota and Honda, some of the big auto industries, is selling the FCV and some of the mobilities devices. And small generations FC is now widely adopted all over Japan right now. And we are trying to create some of the hydrogen fire generations right now. And can you move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So there's some of the numerical targets towards hydrogen society right now. And from the supply side, we are now using almost 100% green hydrogens. Gray hydrogen. And in 10 years, we are trying to establish the international hydrogen supply chain, as well as some of the domestic base of the productions deriving from the power to gas. And within 30 years, we are trying to make the supply chain CO2 free by reducing the carbon intensity. And when it comes to cost, now it is very expensive, $10 per kilograms at retail price at hydrogen station. But we are trying to reduce this cost significantly to the $3 per kilograms in 2030 and $2 per kilograms in 2050. And regarding volumes, now around 200 tons are sold in hydrogen refueling stations. And in addition to this one, so the gray hydrogen is used in a wider industrial application, such as refining process. And we are trying to expand the demand to 300,000 ton in 2013 by expanding the demand in the generation sector mainly, and trying to expand this one furthermore in 2050. And there is some of the demand numerical targets around generation and mobility. And now FC combined heat power, which was powered by natural gas, is one of the main devices around hydrogens. And now mobility sector is on the rise, and we are trying to accelerate this trend in this sector and trying to adopt hydrogen's application more widely. Next slide, please. So as Kato-san said, last year's Prime Minister Suga declared Japan's intentions to aim for the carbon neutrality by 2050. So this is kind of a game changer for hydrogen as well. And we think that this growth strategy, this green strategy is the industrial policy in addition to the energy policy. So which aims to create a positive cycle of economic growth and environmental protections together with the business community. And the aim is to set ambitious goals and fully support the private sector's efforts towards carbon neutrality. So government, it is true that government is taking the lead, but we are not actor. So actor is the private sector. We are trying to push them really hard by supporting the activity. And this strategy includes 5 cross-sectoral policy tools and action plans for 14 sectors. And one of the pillar of this growth strategy was hydrogen, and will be updated continuously. So next slide is kind of essence of the hydrogen's domain of this green growth strategy. So goal is kind of similar to the our hydrogen strategy, but we are trying to expand our demand domain to some other sectors. So even within the mobility sector, so we are focusing on FCV and bus and forklift mainly at this moment. But we are trying to expand our reach to the truck, because truck is the promising sectors which the FC can provide a competitive advantage over the battery EV. And also we are trying to accelerate our actions to commercialize the hydrogen power, large size hydrogen power generations. And in addition to those kind of things, we are trying to get a foothold on the hydrogen usages towards the industrial sector, such as green carbon steel. So green carbon steel is really difficult technology, and it's really difficult to use 100% hydrogens to decarbonize the existing coal processes. And we are trying to push more around the fuel cells as well. And when it comes to the productions, we think that electrolyzer is really key devices because of the because the renewable cost is decreasing rapidly across the globe. So we are trying to contribute to this domain as well. And we are now investing in another innovative R&D to further reduce the cost of hydrogens. And transportation sector, we traditionally put emphasis on this sector, but we try to accelerate the activity as well. And one of the last thing is that the cross-cutting actions is really important, I think. So create the regional models through the demonstration projects is really important because infrastructure, some of the place has a very good infrastructures to take advantage of, to expand the hydrogen demand very rapidly. So we are looking for some of the good place, not limited to Japan, but also all over the world to demonstrate our technology to develop in the future. So this is our essence. And we are now really happy to accelerate the international collaboration as well. So I'm looking forward to the further discussions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Fujioka, and to Mr. Hoskin and Mr. Kato for your presentations. Now we get to the fun stuff, and I've seen folks active in the chat and submitting questions. So I'll invite Mr. Hoskin, Mr. Kato, and Mr. Fujioka all to turn your videos on so that we can get to that dialogue portion, because I have some great questions for each of you. So we saw coming in through the chat a number of questions about the use of green versus blue versus gray hydrogen. Of course, Mr. Hoskin, you referred and mentioned some of the differences and of course, alluded to the fact that the color is not important, but the carbon intensity is. That said, I think it is important to talk about sort of those differences. What is the difference for some of our audience members between green and blue? What are the perceived and real advantages or challenges of each? And in particular, the question around, of course, blue hydrogen and potential environmental impacts of generating hydrogen from fossil fuels versus green hydrogen typically produced from renewables. So maybe Mr. Hoskin, I'll start with you just to respond in a bit more detail in terms of some of those differences and what are some of the challenges and opportunities with the different varieties and where that fits in Canada's strategy. I know you alluded to some of that already.
For sure, thanks. And I wouldn't say it's just Canada's strategy. I would say a number of countries are kind of looking at what the opportunities are. If you see in the past year, more than 30 countries have come out with their own strategies. And so the amount, the time, the sheer quantity of hydrogen that will be required in the next 10, 20 years, green hydrogen production alone, it's unclear. In fact, it's probably impossible to continue to provide the supply that would be required to support all of those strategies, certainly in the next 10 years. And so we can't wait to have 100% green hydrogen. Otherwise, we will have lost at least a decade. So we need to grow the foundational pieces, supply chains, deployment opportunities across different sectors of the economy, while we can currently use innovation to drive down the carbon intensity. To your question about what is green versus blue, I think it's important. So blue, part of it is that there is no standard definition, which is why we need a global standard on carbon intensity. If you say to somebody what is green versus what is blue versus what is brown, there's common understanding, but it's not standardized, right? You can't standardize a color. You can standardize a metric like carbon intensity. That said, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, green hydrogen production technically is electrolytic hydrogen, so using clean electricity, whether that's renewable or other, versus blue. Blue is using some form of natural gas or petroleum with carbon abatement. Carbon abatement could be carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We do have some technology companies in Canada, for instance, that do in situ conversion of petroleum in semi-spent oil wells. They produce the hydrogen and the CO2 remains in the ground, so it never comes out. And that can be done very low carbon. So in fact, there's a couple of studies, including the hydrogen strategy right now in Canada, that shows that you can make hydrogen at a price point and a carbon intensity using natural gas with carbon abatement in some jurisdictions in Canada with lower carbon intensity than you can using electrolytic hydrogen. It really depends on where that electricity is coming from. So life cycle carbon intensity can actually be lower from blue versus quote unquote green in some jurisdictions in Canada at the time being. And that, the price point also is a significant difference between the two.
Thanks, Mr.
Which is why
Hoskin.
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, please finish your thought.
Which is why we're helping, or we're working internationally to get around this, looking at colors and really just focusing on the important part, which is the carbon intensity. Fully aware that we need to drive down the carbon intensity over time.
So Mr. Kato, maybe I can turn to you to build on Mr. Hoskin's comment in terms of Japan's strategy. I heard Mr. Fujioka talking about the strategy to really increase renewable energy in Japan over time, which of course that would be closely tied to the ability to produce green hydrogen. But in terms of some of those, the need for international metrics and standards, where would Japan sort of play? Where would Japan be looking at focusing and the importance of those kinds of standards and definitions? And Mr. Kato, I'll give you an opportunity, and then Mr. Fujioka, I'll go to you next. So Mr. Kato, over to you. Mr. Fujioka, do you want to, oh, sorry, please.
ホスキンさん、ありがとうございます。指標というか基準値というか、どこかで線を引くということではなく、まずその定量的にその水素がどういうバックグラウンドの水素なのかということが分かるように、その見える化していく、その透明性を確保していくということは必要というふうに考えています。その透明性、説明責任を果たす中で、よりその炭素強度の低いものにシフトしていくということが重要というふうに考えています。で、世界的にはその太陽光と風力、変動性再エネを使いこなすということのために、どうしても水素の活用と、水素キャリアの活用というのは国内的に各国必要になっていくということだと思いますので、そちらを追求していくということも必要だと思いますし、先ほど藤岡さんからお話もあった通り、日本資源が限られ、土地や資源が限られているところがあって、輸入水素というものも活用していく必要があろうかと思います。で、その時に、例えばカナダですと EOR、酸素を吹き込んで炭素を固定して水素を取るというようなこともトライアルされているというふうに伺っておりますので、必ずしも、その再生可能エネルギー以外のその方法でもイノベーションにより炭素強度低い水素を取り出すという方法もあり得るかと思いますので、その全体ライフサイクルを見た中で、炭素強度の低さというものが説明していけるということが重要というふうに考えています。私からは以上です。
Thank you so much, Mr. Kato. Mr. Fujioka, I may maybe shift gears so we can cover some other questions. Both from our Canadian speakers and our Japanese speakers talked about the differences or the opportunities at a regional level. On your last slide, you mentioned the need to focus on some of those regional opportunities. I wonder if you could talk a little bit in Japan. What are some of those differences regionally in terms of challenges and opportunities? Mr. Kato mentioned, some of the different resources available. So could you speak to that?
Okay. Thank you very much. Overall, so we are not abundant in the renewable energy, but the renewable energy is clustered in some specific regions. So, for example, in Hokkaido area, northern part of Japan, so that part has a huge potential of the offshore wind. but the demand is not enough to accept almost all of those additional capacity in the future coming from the offshore wind. So in that case, I think there is it's really rational to utilize those additional capacity to produce some of the hydrogen from that renewable energies. But when it comes to Tokyo and some of the metropolitan area, so the renewable potential is really limited, partly because to some of the resources itself, but also related to some of the land prices, because land prices are really expensive in Harajuku or Shibuya or center of Japan. So it's really irrational to import some of the hydrogens from domestic, not only from the domestic, but also from overseas. So that's why we need some of the import from the other countries. And when it comes to the international trade, we adopted a technological neutral approach. So in that sense, I think carbon neutral is a really good KPI to measure whether this is whether that hydrogen is clean or not. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is how to define that clean hydrogens, because everybody has kind of a different understanding around hydrogen. So that's, I think, one of the most challenging part to facilitate the global and internal trade. And how we can develop the infrastructures to supply those hydrogens at the last mile is one of the another biggest challenge, because hydrogen is energy intensity per energy density per cubic meters is very low compared to the natural gas and existing hydrocarbon. So transportation is a really big issue. And Canada is unfortunately has a very sophisticated pipelines all over the country, but Japan is not the case. So we are now trying hard how to transport as well as and distribute those hydrogens at the real end customer. So that is, I think, the two biggest problem and challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Fujioka. I see a question coming in through the chat about, the main consumer of hydrogen, or the main use would be in fuel cells. And of course, we need to see those kinds of technologies scaled up in order to really make use of hydrogen in that way. I wonder, Mr. Hoskin, if you can comment a little bit about, some of those primary uses of hydrogen as a resource and the technologies that would make use of them, and challenges with the scale up, and what the strategy, as well as role of government, private sector in helping with those scale up challenges.
Sure, thanks. And so, yes, fuel cells are one mechanism to use hydrogen, and absolutely, the price point is driving down as you get to scale production of fuel cells. Then that cost competitive aspect increases. I would say the Hydrogen Council released a study in January that showed again that the price point on more than 35 end uses of hydrogen is expected to reach cost comparative with the conventional technologies before 2030. So, innovation continues. There's been more than $80 billion invested or committed to in the past year for hydrogen, and those price points and that competitiveness is going to continue to drive down. But I don't want people on this panel or in this session to think that hydrogen and fuel cells are the only option. Hydrogen is a significant industrial feedstock. It's very important for oil sands upgrading in Canada. It's important for fertilizer production across the world. It can be used to decarbonize the steel manufacturing process. And so as we get access to very low carbon intensity hydrogen, you inherently drive down the carbon intensity, the CO2 footprint of those industrial sectors as well. And so it's not just about electrification using fuel cells, it's about getting cost competitive, low carbon or zero carbon hydrogen as a key feedstock for a number of industrial processes as well.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Hoskin. So I know we're running out of time. I want to pose one final question to each of our panelists, and I'm going to ask you to keep your response very brief. I know that can be challenging, but that's where we get the best information sometimes. So what I want to ask you is, both of your strategies identify some near-term action, some low-hanging fruit. Mr. Hoskin, your presentation referred to opportunities for early adoption from your consultation. So in your mind, recognizing, and I heard from Mr. Kato that, or Mr. Fujioka, that governments aren't actors the way the private sector is, but of course there's a role in supporting private sector scale up. What's the first thing that you see needing to be enacted with these strategies? What's the first thing to do that represents that low-hanging fruit to really develop the hydrogen economies in each of your countries and of course internationally? And maybe Mr. Fujioka, could I start with you? Keeping that very brief, you have to pick one. What is that one action, that one first step that you see your governments being able to take around that strategy?
Thank you. One word, truck, is I think one of the promising part, because that will be commercialized in short term. So, and that could be boost some of the demand in the mobility sector. So we are trying to collaborate some of the auto industries to develop those technologies as well as commercializing those kind of things. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Mr. Kato, one thing, one action, what would be the near-term opportunity in your mind?
企業にインセンティブを与えるということだと思ってまして、先ほどご紹介した地球温暖化対策法の中で、一定の大規模の企業については、その CO2 の排出量を全部デジタル化して、オープン化するということをやってますので、そのような中で水素の利用、どのように位置づけられていくかっていうのを今後検討することとしております。
Excellent, thank you. And Mr. Hoskin, last but certainly not least, one action, one thing, what's the low-hanging fruit? What can government do first?
Global collaboration. We need to establish global supply chains and build the momentum, continue to build the momentum.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers, Mr. Hoskin, Mr. Kato, Mr. Fujioka. Thank you for spending some time with us. And we're going to move on in our agenda, and we hope you'll stick around for the rest of the session.
Thank you.
So thanks everybody for sticking with us. I want to take an opportunity to take a bit of a stretch break at this point. We've had some really great information and some great questions in the chat. So I'll encourage you now, if you'd like to stand up, take a stretch. We're going to do a quick out of seat activity so that we move around a little bit. And what I'm going to ask you to do is look around the room, stand up, and grab something that represents how you're feeling about the hydrogen ecosystem right at this moment. So I'm attached by my headphones, so I'm not going to get up and walk, but I do have my item right over here, so I'll just slide. So my item is my Garmin cycling computer. The reason I chose this item is this has been a game changer for me in terms of my cycling, my ability to track and know what I'm doing. I have a power meter. I know how fast I'm pedaling. I know how far I've gone. And so when I think of the hydrogen ecosystem and the opportunity, I see it as a game changer. So that was my item that I grabbed. And I know it looks like I'm in a very cool studio setting here, but if you were here in the room, you'd see my bike hanging on the wall beside me because I know we're all joining from home. So that's my item that I feel is a game changer. So I'm just going to offer you the opportunity to share in your chat. Get up, take a stretch, grab your item and share in the chat an item that really represents how you're feeling about the hydrogen ecosystem. While you're doing that, though, in the interest of time, I am going to keep us going because we want to keep on time, want to keep on schedule, and just make sure we're respecting all of our speakers and our attendees' time. So I'm going to move on to the next part of our program, which is entitled Exploring Opportunities for Canada-Japan Cooperation on Clean Hydrogen. And I know we had a request to have a look at the agenda for just a little bit longer, so we're going to leave that up on screen for a bit so you can have a look at that. During this next conversation, we'll be largely focusing on bilateral collaboration, including its opportunities and challenges, but we'll also touch on other forms of collaboration, including First Nations and Indigenous collaboration, government collaboration on hydrogen. There will again, of course, be opportunities to ask questions, so please get them into the chat as you're listening, and we'll do our best to bring those to the speaker's attention. So to get the conversation going, it's my pleasure to welcome our speakers. First from Canada, we have Dr. David Laizell, Research Director with the Transition Accelerator. We have Mr. Daniel Brock, Associate and Chair of the Government Relations and Strategy Practice Group at Hoskin Law Firm. We have Mr. Isidore Day, CEO and founder of Bimadzin, Bimadzwin Inc., group of companies, which I understand means life in Anishinaabe, and former regional chief of Ontario. Joining us from Japan, we have Ms. Ito Maya, partner and lawyer with Nishimura and Asahi, and of course, Professor Ishii Kazue, professor at the Laboratory of Sustainable Material Cycle Systems in the Faculty of Engineering and Director of Research and Education for Robust Agriculture for the Forestry and Fisheries Industry at Hokkaido University. Welcome to all my speakers. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. And we're going to start, I'm going to invite each of our speakers to provide quick 2-minute who and what statements so we can get to know you a little bit better. So from each of you, I'll call you by name to talk about who you are, the perspective you're bringing, and the role you and your organization is playing in the hydrogen ecosystem. So 2 minutes, Dr. Laizell, I'd love to start with you.
Great, thank you very much. My name is David Laizell. I'm a professor at the University of Calgary, but an energy systems architect with the Transition Accelerator, a national not-for-profit corporation that is working to advance or accelerate the transition to net zero energy systems. Canada is an exciting place because it's one of the world's lowest cost producers of low carbon hydrogen, whether you're from green or blue hydrogen. In Western Canada, where I am in Calgary and in other parts of Western Canada, we can actually produce hydrogen at an energy price that is about half the wholesale cost of diesel or 1/3 the retail cost in Canada. Despite this advantage in being able to produce low carbon hydrogen and low cost, we are fully aware that the transporting, compressing, and using hydrogen to deliver energy services is actually more challenging than it is for traditional fossil fuels. So to make the economics work, we must get to scale quickly. For this reason, we're very supportive of the Canadian government's the hydrogen strategy to focus around hubs, where we can actually get to scale very rapidly. We're focusing our initial work on the Edmonton region. It's a city about 300 kilometers where I am, which already produces about 2,000 tons of hydrogen per day. It's producing that and using it to make fertilizer and as an industrial feedstock. We're working, and about 40% of that hydrogen is already made with carbon capture and storage. So we're working with those companies to produce a hydrogen hub where we can produce a low carbon hydrogen corridor, which will attract heavy freight vehicles, trains, and trucks. We're keen on working with Japanese companies on this, and also looking at potential for hydrogen export to Japan, possibly as ammonia. So we're keen to explore opportunities to collaborate with Japan and other countries to both find markets for our low carbon hydrogen, but also provide markets for their products here that might use the hydrogen that we produce. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Laizell. Mr. Brock, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah, hi, everyone. So my name is Dan Brock. I'm a law partner at the firm Fasken Martineau de Moulin here in Toronto, Canada. I'm the chair of the firm's government relations practice. Fasken, by Canadian standards, is a large national firm. We have offices across Canada and in London, UK, and Johannesburg, South Africa. I want to start with a bit of a disclaimer. I'm also a bit of a hydrogen enthusiast. In addition to government relations, I'm co-lead of my firm's hydrogen energy advisory team, what we call H2 Heat. Our hydrogen advisory practice is the first of its kind in Canada, specializing in assisting our clients on all facets of the transition of hydrogen into the Canadian and global energy systems. Outside the firm, I'm the chair of a not-for-profit organization that I helped to create a few years ago called H2Go Canada. H2Go works with governments and private sector stakeholders to identify and help foster sustainable, competitive markets for hydrogen use here in Canada. And I'm formerly the lead external advisor to the Canadian Fuel Cell Electric Vehicle Coalition, which was made up of 6 auto manufacturers: Honda, Toyota, Kia, Hyundai, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW. And the FCEV Coalition, as we called it, led a campaign between 2016 and 2018 in awareness raising among government decision makers at the federal and provincial level here in Canada of the need and importance for developing the system for refueling infrastructure across Canada to support the deployment of FCEVs in Canada. And I was heartened to see in the Canadian strategy that the government expects there to be 5 million FCEVs on the roads in Canada by 2050, and I'm quite confident that if that is the case, many of those vehicles will come from Japan. I'm delighted to be on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brock. So far, so good. 2 minutes. You guys are killing it. Thank you for staying to time. Over to you, Mr. Day, who you are and what brings you here.
Okay, so greetings and welcome to the Canadian-Japanese delegation. My name is Isidore Day. I'm coming from the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, which is a pre-Confederate treaty in Canada. I just want to acknowledge all of those folks that did give land acknowledgements, and to not only the Japanese and Canadian delegation, but all other guests from other global jurisdictions. Welcome to this very important dialogue on leveraging bilateral opportunities. It is critical that First Nations play a significant role in developing and maintaining Canada's hydrogen strategy. As the original peoples, we have a duty and we maintain a responsibility to protect the land, the air, the water. And I might also add that there's an interesting discussion around energy and the concept of fire, that first legacy fuel from the sun. There's an Indigenous perspective on energy that I think is going to be very valuable as we look to achieve the 2050 target of a carbon neutral reality. Hydrogen, clean energy, it's all about protecting our planet, and something that Indigenous people should be very much part of. As the former regional chief in Ontario, I negotiated a 2.4% share of the ownership of Hydro One assets. I also developed a number of policies that brought forward the Ontario Green Energy and Economy Act, a world well-known policy in Ontario that looked at scaling up in green energy over the last 15 years. This was all done within the context of bilateral relationships between Ontario and First Nation governments. Large-scale hydro projects, wind, solar, and nuclear power are all key components in hydrogen production. First Nations in Ontario have already become key players. Henvey Inlet First Nation, as an example, has the largest wind farm in Canada, while Six Nations has one of the largest solar farms in Ontario. In terms of the carbon capture from the oil and gas industry, First Nations in British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan have spent decades as key players in oil and gas. The Indian Oil and Gas Canada is a federal agency that regulates oil and gas on reserves. I would recommend that they become fully involved in Canada's hydrogen strategy. Just winding down my comments here, it's this type of investment partnerships that First Nations must seek with industry and government. We need to be fully involved in the hydrogen economy right from the beginning. So much to talk about, but generally my context and my contributions will focus on this notion of bilateral. I do believe that there's a very important discussion and dialogue that needs to be had around establishing double bilaterals with Indigenous communities in Canada, Japan, and Canada, and there's very good reason for doing that. So again, it's really, really great to be here. Really exciting discussion, and I just want to thank all the contributors and thank you for allowing me to be a guest.
It's our pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. Ms. Ito, over to you. Opening remarks. Who are you and what brings you here?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am Maya Ito, and it's an honor to be able to participate in this clean hydrogen event. The next, please. Okay, so I am a partner at a leading law firm, Nishimura Sahi, in Japan, and I am the head of the International Renewables team. And we are the largest law firm in Japan, having over 700 plus lawyers and 18 plus offices throughout the globe. And I myself is located in Tokyo, and my main practice area is finance. And I have been practicing finance for almost 20 years now. So since the implementation of the feed-in tariff law in Japan, which took place in 2011, renewable energy deals have been increasing year by year. Could you turn it over to the next? Sorry, that's all the awards that we won. So next, please, sorry. So that's my introduction. And the implementation of the FIT law took place in 2011. And first, the solar power projects boomed, and then it shifted to wind power, and then now to the offshore wind power projects. And I personally have been involved in over 50 plus inbound solar power projects and many wind power projects as well. And recently the trend has now shifted to offshore wind power projects. And of course, I'm now involved in them as well. As to hydrogen, it is not part of the FIT law, but since the implementation of the basic hydrogen strategy, which was explained by the people from MOE and METI earlier in 2017, the Japanese government is focused to realize the hydrogen society in Japan towards the carbon neutral target in 2015, which was announced by Prime Minister Suga as well. So as a legal advisor, we have been involved in the hydrogen-related JVs and hydrogen gas stations, and I will be delighted to share with you all the actual situation that we are facing from a Japanese legal perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mazito. And last but not least, Professor Ishii, please, some remarks from you. Who are you and what brings you here?
はい、北海道大学の石井と申します。よろしくお願いいたします。私は皆さんご存知のように、日本の北の北海道という、島ですね。気候は非常にカナダと近いものがありますので、非常に一番日本の中でも、気持ちも自然も、それから、地理的にも近いというふうに思っております。今日は本当にありがとうございます。私は廃棄物の研究をずっとやっておりまして、バイオマスの利活用、マテリアル利用だけじゃなくて、エネルギー利用ということで、メタン発酵のバイオガスだとか、そういったような研究をずっと行ってきて、で、特にですね、いかに地域にそのシステムを根付かせるかと、社会実装するかという、技術と社会と両方の面から、そのシステムをその地域に根付かせるというような視点で、地域密着型でいろいろな仕事を行ってきました。先ほど環境省の加藤さんからお話がありましたように、北海道ではいくつか水素のプロジェクトがすでに立ち上がっていまして、鹿追町の糞尿からメタンガスですね。で、メタンガスから水素を作って、で、その水素を使っていただくというようなプロジェクト。それから、室蘭市では余剰の風力発電から出てきた電気を水田会で水素にして、でそれを地域で急増合金でサプライチェーンを組んでですね、で使うという、この2つの委員会の私、座長を務めさせていただいております。それから、北海道の水素協議会っていうのがありまして、そこの副座長として、北海道での水素の利用のビジョンの作成だとか、あるいは2050年に向けたロードマップの作成に貢献してきたということです。何か本日ですね、私の力がお役に立てればと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Ishii. So I have a few questions to kick us off, and I will also encourage our audience members to start putting your questions for this fantastic group in the chat. But to start, so we heard from some of the government presenters earlier, some of the technology opportunities that are being explored. Dr. Laizell, though, I know you're deeply immersed with the Transition Accelerator in these opportunities. And so I wonder, what are the core technologies that are really required or being developed in Canada and Japan that can help us realize our ambitions? Like, what's your perspective? I know we've heard about fuel cells, pros and cons, different uses of hydrogen, green, blue, but let's hear from you sort of what's your top one and what's the major barrier?
Well, certainly we're talking about creating a new value chain. So we need technologies all along the value chain. But if I had to pick one, it's really about demand. We're not going to shift to producing and using hydrogen unless we actually have the demand. And so I would argue we're looking at hydrogen using vehicles in particular, because we pay more in Canada, I expect in Japan as well. We pay more for transportation fuels per unit of energy than we pay for heating fuels or industrial feedstocks. And so there's a better economic opportunity to get this off the ground and moving to target the transportation sector. And so hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, hydrogen diesel vehicles, I think are an opportunity for rapid development. and the technologies for compressing the gases and getting the whole value chain supply to make sure we keep the cost so it can be competitive with our current fossil fuel sector, as close competitive as possible, so we can get a real demand for new hydrogen supply.
I think it's Dan Brock here. I think it is the technologies, but I think, David, you touched on the point, which I think is one of the key barriers in Canada, probably most jurisdictions that want to transition to hydrogen. And that is not only the lack of the supply chain technology, it's also the lack of the supply chain expertise and experience. So we have the hydrogen fuel cell technology is mature technology. The fuel cell vehicles that we were promoting through the FCEV coalition, these aren't demonstration vehicles, these are replacement vehicles. And the only real challenge to these cars being used to displace gas burning internal combustion engines was the lack of refueling infrastructure and the attendant lack of a supply chain to deliver the fuels to those dispensing locations. So, and it's not just in the mobility space, but there are lots of other applications which are ripe for transition to clean hydrogen. But until we have really the invest in the capacity to deliver that last mile for hydrogen in cost-effective ways, it's going to continue to be a challenge.
Ms. Ito, please. I wanted to go to you next. Please jump in. Yeah.
Thank you. So in the basic energy plan that was introduced by METI, the fuel cell vehicles are referred to one of the more feasible technologies. And in the current basic energy plan, it says it's important to promote fuel cell vehicles and hydrogen stations, which are the core of the hydrogen utilization in mobility. And more specifically, the government is targeting the creation of 320 hydrogen stations by 2025, and also aiming at independent business operation of hydrogen station by the latter half of the 2020s. And the government also aims to promote the spread of approximately 200,000 FCVs by 2025 and approximately 800,000 of the same by 2030. So in order to achieve these goals, is explained in the presentation of METI, the barriers we face in Japan, I think, are high costs in production of hydrogen. And we do see some private companies providing efforts to realizing this mass production supply. And one of the examples is a company called JHYM, J-H-Y-M. And it was established in February 2018 and among 11 companies initially. And with the goal of development of hydrogen stations. And now it's consisted by 25 companies, and some of the companies are very famous, like Toyota, Nissan, Honda, ENEOS, Tokyo Gas, Idemitsu, and SMBC. And they aim to support the creation of hydrogen stations and operation of hydrogen stations as well. And they have reached, as a result, the total number of hydrogen stations maintained by JHYM has reached 55 as of today. And also the total number has reached to 143. So this kind of efforts made by Japanese companies will be very supportive to realizing this hydrogen society.
This raises a question for me, for you, Isidore, Mr. Day, in terms of the opportunity for Canadian and Japanese companies alike to work with Indigenous communities, where, of course, there's opportunities, as you mentioned, renewable energy development that can fuel clean hydrogen, but also charging infrastructure, right? So where First Nations have vast traditional territories and the need to work with, if we want to see hydrogen, for example, used for long haul trucking, things like that. What's the opportunity there in terms of the infrastructure piece, Isidore, to work with First Nations? And what should that look like? How can Canadian Japanese companies, what do they need to know to think about partnering with communities?
Thank you so much, Liz, for the question. This is a really good perspective type question, because First Nations are not all the same in Canada. There are First Nations that are located closer to urban centers. There are many that are in rural scenarios, and then there are remote communities. I'll just take the remote community perspective for a second. There are well over 25 communities in Northern Ontario These are First Nation communities that have had no running water, they've had no water and sewer, and they're now just getting a power line put into those communities for the purpose of the mining industry. Now, I believe that where we're at right now with the energy supply mix in the north is we're at the front end of it. So if we're going to scale up into these northern communities where mining companies want to go in and assert development, bilateral relationships are vital. Working with various levels of government and First Nations as governments. But I think that backing this rate up, in order to see hydrogen accelerate in the north, there is going to be a need to have hydrogen literacy. When we looked at the energy policies of Ontario and Canada over the last 20 years, First Nations were able to do a lot better in the industry when we scaled up in capacity and helping understand the opportunities. So I'm going to go right to basics on this one. Hydrogen literacy and looking at the complex energy supply mix change policy that Canada wants to work with First Nations directly.
Thank you so much for that. Really insightful. Professor Ishii, I want to switch gears a bit and pose a question to you, because like many regions in Canada, Hokkaido is rich in natural resources, as we've heard. And I know there are some partnership opportunities already underway between Hokkaido and Canada. We have some sister city relationships between Alberta and Hokkaido. And so where do you see the opportunities for collaboration between Canada and Japan coming from a natural resource rich region?
はい、ありがとうございます。まず、エネルギーといった場合に、今日、水素の話ですけれども、我々、電気と、それからいわゆる暖房、あとお湯、それから車の燃料と、この3つのカテゴリーに考えなきゃいけなくて、おそらくカナダでは、暖房は木質のバイオマスだとか、そういったものも結構使われていると思うんですけれども、やっぱり日本、あるいは北海道では、やはり個別の暖房で灯油の利用が非常に多いということがあってですね、その部分をいかに他のもので切り替えていくかっていうのが、脱炭素の部分では大事になってきます。で、その時に、水素を本当に熱利用として、電気と熱利用として、個々の一軒の家で使うのかどうか、それとも、地域のエネルギー供給的な形でやっていくのかどうかっていうところが、少しこの日本とヨーロッパ、カナダとアメリカと少しシステムの違うところなので、まずそこの違いをちょっと分かっていただきたいなというふうに思います。それからですね、日本では、大都市から水素っていうものをどんどん入れていってるんですけれども、一方の違う考え方すると、やっぱり北海道で行くと、やっぱり交通のインフラっていうものが人口が少なっているので、いわゆるトレインだとかバスだとかがどんどん人が少なくなってきて、需要が少なくなってきていると。で、どんどん経費的に合わなくなってきて、廃れていっているので、例えばそういうところに水素だとか、水素バスだとか、トラックだとかっていうのを入れていくと。何が言いたいかというと、中央だけじゃなくて、地方の需要のこの掘り起こしも同時に分散型のネットワークということでやっていくということが、重要じゃないかなと。そういうところで、非常にカナダもかなり分散的な社会を構築していると思いますので、そういった社会そのもののあり方っていうもの自体が参考になるのかなという気がします。で、もう一つですね、すいません、長くなって。先ほど経産省の藤岡さんから風力の話がありました。北海道でも洋上風力が非常に盛んで、その余った電気をどうするかということで、水素にするんですけれども、電気で本州に運ぶのか、水素にしてから北海道内、本州に運ぶのかといったところが、サプライチェーンの問題があります。そのような点でも、広大なカナダとのパートナーシップというものが、参考に非常になるのかなというふうに思っているところです。ありがとうございます。
Thank you so much. I want to come
Elizabeth,
back
Elizabeth,
to actually
may
the whole panel on that issue of, or the opportunity perhaps around education and building awareness and literacy. Isidore mentioned that that's an opportunity for First Nations, but I see a comment in the chat that it is a challenge and an opportunity for the general public as well. And so we're going back a bit to first principles, but both the Canadian and Japanese strategies would have identified the need for that, right? For that basic literacy and understanding for uptake. So I'm going to go back to Dr. Laizell, but I'm going to come to each of you. What's the story that you would tell? And again, so this is your elevator pitch to the public. What's the story that you would tell, that compelling story to help build that literacy component for the average citizen in Japan or Canada? Dr. Laizell, to you first.
Yeah, I think part of it is to really start to describe a clear view of what a net zero energy future looks like in 2050. And I think it's very clear it's not all about hydrogen. Hydrogen is an important pillar in it, but it's a lot about electrification. It's about changing our end-use fuels, the fuels that we use, and we're reliant on carbon-intense end-use fuels. It's very clear that we won't be able to continue to be using carbon-rich end-use fuels, gasoline, diesel, and even natural gas in the future if we really want to get to net zero. And so what we have to do is find zero emission fuels. Electricity is one of those, or energy carriers, essentially. Electricity is one of those. So we are going to need to have a very significant increase in our size of our electricity grid. And we're also going to need hydrogen as a energy carrier, chemically based energy carrier. So I think the issue, the part of the message is, you often get in this feeling that if you're arguing for hydrogen, it's seen as being anti-electricity. My sense is they're partners. In fact, you can make hydrogen from electricity, you can make electricity from hydrogen, and we need a transition pathway to get us there. And so we have to make sure there's a clear understanding of what our objective is nationally, both not only with First Nations, but with the entire population, and actually around the world. So I think this is a common narrative that we need to get a clear vision of where we're trying to go.
Daniel, I want to go to you next. And there was actually a question earlier when we had our government speakers about, what does hydrogen replace? Does it replace coal? Does it replace nuclear? And so Dave, great comment in terms of, no, it's not a replacement. It's complementary with energy strategy. But Daniel, I want to go to you with that in mind. And then, so what's the narrative? What do I'm a game changer. What's the narrative that I tell my colleagues and my friends?
I have a glass of water, otherwise known as the emissions from a fuel cell vehicle. Listen, hydrogen is safe. It's a safe fuel, properly handled. A hydrogen vehicle in a catastrophic accident is not going to catch fire and burn, not like a gasoline vehicle will. Hydrogen is abundant. It's the most abundant element in the universe, but it's also in abundant supply and potential supply in Canada. If we move to a meaningful role for hydrogen in the global energy mix, Canada is going to be an energy powerhouse. We have the capacity to produce massive amounts of clean and green hydrogen for our domestic use, but importantly for export overseas, but also to our neighbors to the south. And it's clean. The use of this energy in various applications, whether it's mobility, stationary power, heating buildings, you name it, even in the industrial processes, cement making, steel making, it is a clean energy that is going to significantly, as it is deployed, reduce in those key sectors our GHG emissions. I'm not aware of any credible study that has us reaching net zero by 2050, where hydrogen is not a key component of the energy mix. That just isn't out there. And remember, a hydrogen vehicle is actually an electric vehicle. There's this sort of false debate that exists. I think Elon Musk sort of perpetuates this notion that a fuel cell vehicle it doesn't make any sense. Why not just have a battery electric vehicle? They're both electric vehicles. The only difference is how you store the energy on the vehicle. And the advantage of fuel cell vehicles, the light duty applications, so the Honda Clarity or the Toyota Mirai or the Hyundai Nexo, that's not the most compelling case for the use of hydrogen. The relative savings in terms of emissions and the cost of the fuel, the benefits are not as profound as they are, as David knows, if we can displace diesel from Class 8 tractor trailers and larger vehicles, transportations, in air travel, and in trains, and in, as I said, industrial processes. So that's those. I think the elevator got stuck, and I've been now inundating you with my elevator pitch. You're pushing the button trying to get off, but those are some of the key things that I think people need to remember.
That's great, Daniel. But I think this is important because we're all champions of a hydrogen economy, and yet it's not what necessarily well understood. And so Maya, I'd love to hear from you, in and around the law firm or with your colleagues, and just building on the narrative that David and Daniel started. What's your elevator pitch? We are going to go to questions from the chat after we hear from each of our panelists here, but I think this is really interesting. So please, Maya.
Thank you. So I guess hydrogen is not very close to our general everyday life right now. But I think in order to improve the hydrogen literacy, we do need to increase the volume of hydrogen vehicle, which may be the most closest tool that we have in our daily lives. But the price difference between an FCV and a hybrid vehicle is currently around 3 million Japanese yen, which is approximately like $30,000 US, and which is significant. So I think people would not directly go and consider buying an FCV at this point. And also, given the scarcity of gas stations, we cannot kind of just directly go and buy an FCV and say, I'm living in a very clean society. So I think we do, first of all, we do need to lower the cost of FCV vehicles and also the costs of hydrogen itself. I think that's an important point that we see in the Japanese market.
Wait, Maya. Isidore, I want to go to you because you raised this literacy issue. And so, what would you share with your friends and your colleagues in your community as they're asking you why would I want to buy a hydrogen vehicle, or what's the value of this hydrogen economy? What would be your elevator pitch before they stop the elevator?
Well, we have to make a parallel comparison between what is happening with the COVID virus and what is happening with climate change. Those are two comparative issues right now that have the world on our heels. So from that perspective, we look at this notion of a national narrative, with another national narrative, basically combining this notion and normalizing hydrogen as a lifesaver. It would strike me that there's not a lot of technologies that are comparative to hydrogen. The complex nature of the scale up and scale out, the fact that we've got to do vertical and horizontal integration at lightning speed, it almost likens it to the situation we just seen with the development of a vaccine at an accelerated pace. So I think there's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of operatives that are happening right now. And I would say that we should all just focus on the fact that hydrogen is an opportunity to triage this issue around the rising climate issues and the impact on the land. Last thing I'll say is that I think the point made is that we all need to become more understanding and have more detailed information about what we share into this mix of a solution, because I'm not sure if people know this, but in Northern Ontario, in Canada here, we have the second largest carbon sink in the world. So the peat moss landscape in the James Bay lowlands is a very, very environmentally sensitive territory that is now open to a lot of mining exploration development. And I think we all have an interest in making sure that whatever's happening in another jurisdiction, this notion of a global literacy around hydrogen, I think we all need to get on side with this one because it could save lives.
Thank you, Isidore. Ishi, what do you tell your students or your colleagues at the university when you want to help them understand the importance of hydrogen and moving to that hydrogen economy? Your really short version when you want to convince somebody that this is the way to go. How do we build that education and awareness?
はい、ありがとうございます。簡単に言うとなかなか、難しい、ですけれども、まず、我々推進している方、我々がですね、まず絶対水素社会は来るんだと、固く信じていることを、まず信念として、メッセージとして学生だとか、いろんな大学の関係者に伝えることっていうのが、まず大事だというふうに思います。決して今でも早すぎない。必ずその時代は来ると。必ずその選択肢は我々は手にすると。今、非常に一般の方々と、その水素社会っていうのは遠いですね。だけれども、いずれそれは近くなってくるということを、固く、信念を持って、信じるってことがまず大事かなというふうに思っております。以上です。
Thank you. I want to turn to some of the questions now that are coming in through the chat. And we did have a question, and I'm going to turn to some of our technical experts on this one in terms of the power conversion efficiency of lithium or hydrogen. And so I did, Dr. Laizell, David, is that something you could address for our audience?
Sure, I could talk about it. Certainly, I mean, if you're starting with natural gas and you're trying to make hydrogen, it's about 74%, 75% efficient in terms of higher heat value product. So that's the hydrogen you get is about 74, 75% of the energy in the natural gas. If you're doing electrolysis, you're about maybe 76% efficient. So it's similar efficiency in converting electricity into hydrogen. But the issue ultimately is you also have to make the electricity, et cetera. The issue, I mean, efficiency is important, don't get me wrong, but it's not the only factor. We actually are awash in huge amounts of solar energy. It's, what's really more important in Canadian society is the cost, the economic cost and the environmental cost of our energy. And so we want to be as efficient as possible, but what really determines investment and decision making is actually economics, and more and more, hopefully more and more, the environmental footprint. So let's look at that. And I think there is one could go in circles talking about efficiencies. I'd say if you can use an electric vehicle, absolutely use it. A plug-in electric, fantastic. That would be my choice. But in heavy trucks, in trains, and in many applications, plug-in battery electric just doesn't work, and that's the place where hydrogen plays an extremely important role.
Thank you so much, David. We did have a couple questions coming in through the chat. One related to safety, which Daniel, I know you addressed in your remarks. What about safety of transport, for example, in a trade relationship between Canada and Japan? I also wanted to build on that question because there was one targeted for our legal experts in terms of non-technical but more regulatory issues and barriers. So safety standards, those kinds of elements. Daniel, I'll start with you, and then Maya, maybe I'll go to you.
Well, there's a lot of work that has been done, is being done currently in Canada especially, but also internationally on updating codes and standards to manage and handle alternative fuels and hydrogen in particular safely. So that's when I talk about safety again, and David or others will correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any fatality related to death related to a hydrogen accident from transportation, for example. So the track record of the technology, it's early days yet still, but the track record of the technology on safety is extremely strong. And again, I told the story before about, and it is sort of illustrative when I talk to people, as a hydrogen enthusiast, I try to to talk to people about it when I can. And one comparison I'll give is this idea of an accident. If you can imagine an accident with a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, first of all, the tank in which the hydrogen is stored is incredibly strong. The engineering around that is remarkably advanced. But let's say, for the sake of argument, you actually did have a puncture. And let's say close to the puncture, there was an ignition source. The hydrogen will leave the tank on the vehicle so quickly that it won't really get time to ignite. And if it does ignite, it will ignite in a very narrow band for a very short time. So the vehicle itself won't be engulfed in flames. And again, as I said before, we're all aware of cars, internal combustion engine cars that will, have problems with fuel lines, et cetera, or in an accident, and they will combust. So at a basic sort of human level, interaction level, and again, Maya mentioned, the cost of owning a hydrogen vehicle, fuel cell vehicle today is very high. There are very few of them that are being produced globally. That production is going to increase dramatically. I hope some of that production comes to Canada, but it's been focused so far in Asia and in Europe mostly. And so what's going to bring the price of those vehicles down is going to be an increase in demand. And the demand is only going to become increased when you have somewhere you could refuel these vehicles. It's a chicken and egg problem. But until that demand is created and those vehicles get produced, the price of the technology is going to continue to be high.
Maya, I wanted to go to you. You referenced the high cost as a barrier. What are some of the other barriers, opportunities on the non-technical side in terms of perhaps safety standards, regulations that you've had to address in your time?
Right. So in Japan, there is a law called High Pressure Gas Safety Act of Japan. And this is a law that requires safe handling of compressed gas, which includes hydrogen gas also. And so if a company manufactures a high pressure hydrogen gas container to be installed in an FCV, that company must perform in accordance with the technical standards set by METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. And because of that hurdle, the implementation of FCVs was somewhat kind of difficult. So in order to avoid this inspection requirement, METI registration can be considered as well. So the government is currently considering simplifying this permission procedures for hydrogen containers and also simplifying the licensing procedures and registration procedures as well. And furthermore, lowering the number of normal pressure is being considered as well in order to support smooth establishment of hydrogen stations. But as we have been discussing, this relaxation of these laws and regulations are very welcome in order to introduce more FCVs and gas stations to the market. But on the other hand, we can't forget that the original laws and regulations were implemented in order to secure safety for the citizens. So the government is aware of that as well, and they are doing a thorough research and inspections, and they will be able to present a new law with confidence with relaxation as well.
Excellent, thank you. Isidore, we have a question for you that's come in through the chat. First of all, agreement in terms of the need for education, literacy, and training opportunities, but a question in particular on your view on the potential to produce hydrogen locally in remote communities or otherwise using electrolysis that would be produced by some of those renewable energy sources that First Nations are getting into the business of. Thoughts on those opportunities?
Yeah, for sure. I think that this notion of a carbon neutral community, there's a lot of opportunity in the remote north right now, and the reason I say that is because right now with communities that never had roads before, they're getting roads now. Communities that never had electricity before, they're getting it now. With that comes along mining companies that are looking at certain developments, and there may be some value here in actually the build out of an industrial application for hydrogen, and looking at how a cluster of communities in a certain region may in fact be almost like an incubator opportunity to look at how you scale up and scale out a hydrogen economy within a certain region. So I think that there's great potential in the remote north. As far as the urban centers go, listen, we've done great work in terms of building out partnerships. I think what's going to work here is figuring out how we, like we did in the feed and tariff program in Ontario, we added an Aboriginal adder. And what the Aboriginal adder did was it said if there are partnerships between Indigenous people and the private sector, there's added points. And then we built out a proposal to do an Aboriginal loan guarantee program. So we were able to find ways to scale up into the green energy movement in the last 20 years. And I think we need to do the same with hydrogen. Focus on those communities, build the literacy, find out the mechanisms and the pathways for collaborative policy. And that's why I say double bilateral relationships between Canada, the First Nations, Japan, and the First Nations. And, out of that, we will find trilateral solutions to, scaling up hydrogen in those more remote communities.
Great. Ishii, I want to target a question to you, and then I'm going to come back with a final question for the whole panel before we wrap at the top of the hour here. This has been fantastic. Professor Ishii, I wanted to ask, we've seen in the chat some different comment about the best use of hydrogen, some saying it's not suitable for cars, yes, for trucks and heavier transport. Someone earlier asked a question about what about airlines? And someone commented, yeah, we're using them in rockets. I wondered if you could comment on in your mind, I don't know about that one either, but if you could comment in your mind and so what are the most promising applications and are there ones that we shouldn't necessarily focus on?
はい、ありがとうございます。必ずしも、飛行機かとかロケットとかまでは私専門じゃないので分かりませんけれども、まず身近なものでいくと、やはりよく日本でも EV か FCV かというお話があります。で、その時にやっぱり EV は買い物に行く程度、それから FCV はもうちょっと距離が長いところというところで、北海道で行きますと、やっぱりちょこっと移動するんでも、EV の航続距離では今のところ少し足りませんので、やっぱり北海道では普通の乗用車であっても FCV の方が利用価値は高い。特に企業の方なんかは営業で北海道中車で回りますから、非常に FCV の需要は高いと。それから先ほど申し上げたように、バスとトラックですね。で、北海道は天然ガスのトラックを普及させようと思ったんですけれども、それは失敗しました。なので、次、もし水素をやるとすれば、もう次は失敗はできないと思います。そういったところでの大型のところの輸送インフラから、北海道はやっていくべきだと思います。
Great, thank you so much. So we are nearing the top of the hour. I have a final question that I want to go around and address to each of you. And that is, we're here together all about collaboration, the opportunity for Canada-Japan collaboration, for business, for government, and for individuals. And so we did have a question come in, which I love, which is what's the most meaningful or significant opportunity for collaboration, perhaps a specific initiative that you're aware of, or what's the most exciting opportunity for collaboration in your mind as we look to advance the hydrogen economy? And with just a few minutes left until 6 o'clock, again, I'll ask you to go to your best example, and I'll go backwards this time. So I'll start, Professor Ishii, with you, if that's okay. What's the most exciting or the best opportunity for collaboration in your mind to advance the hydrogen economy? Again, I know it's challenging, but a quick response would be great.
はい、おそらく、日本もカナダもいろいろな技術がまだ実施の段階、あるいはコストに問題があるだとか、いろいろな規制な問題があると思いますので、まずその、苦しみといいますか、努力をですね、まず共にするということがすごく大事かなというふうに思います。それで、カナダと日本が協力して、とにかく世界の先進を行くんだと、先端を行くんだという、そういう気概を持ってですね、パートナーとしてやっていけるのが一番いいかなというふうに思っています。以上です。ありがとうございました。
Thank you. Isidore, I'm going to go to you next. We had a comment in the chat saying you're spot on with your triage approach. But to you, what's your best opportunity for collaboration that you see to advance the hydrogen economy? The classic line, you're on mute, Isidore.
Yes.
It had to happen to somebody.
Sorry. You know what? I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say it just point blank. Hydrogen is an opportunity to save a lot of lives in very short order. Why? We know what climate change has the potential to do, but I think we're also going to have an opportunity to set out with other Indigenous communities around the world opportunities to collaborate on a nation-to-nation level. Now, when I came into this presentation this evening, I had to ask myself, what is the most impactful thing I can speak about? And it's going to be to recognize that Indigenous people under the Indian Act, under a race-based system, this is not the way to work with us from a community perspective, from a business perspective, and from a government perspective. I would extend my humble request to the Canadian and Japanese governments to look to establish these bilateral discussions, to find out the value system that can actually help create an underfabric within a hydrogen build out in our territories that is going to have a much more altruistic perspective to it versus commercial gain. There's a lot to be said around relationships here, and I think that there's a lot more that is going to bring us together with hydrogen than say any other sector, i.e. nuclear. Hydrogen has just something really good about it, and it's an Indigenous response. I believe if we can be involved in hydrogen development and to build out the solution to get one vehicle from one end of the country to the next, without having to put gasoline in that vehicle. I think we can do that with hydrogen technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maya, the best opportunity you see for collaboration, whether between our countries or a specific initiative, over to you.
Thank you. So I think there are lots of collaborations, I guess, opportunities between Canada and Japan, but I think the best one that I can think of is creating a low-cost hydrogen supply chain. And I think one good example would be a collaboration between Australia and Japan that is currently going on. And this is led by an association called HYSTRA, H-Y-S-T-R-A. And on the Japan side, J-Power, Shell, Iwatani, Kawasaki Heavy, and all the famous companies are involved in this. And they are experimenting and they're building a hydrogen energy supply chain between Australia and Japan. And it's a brown coal gasification. They use the gasification technology in Australia, and they do a long distance transportation of liquefied hydrogen, and it would be imported into Japan. And I think this would be a good example of how Canada and Japan could collaborate. And I think with the support of Canadian government and Japanese government, and also Canada with abundant technology and resources, we will be able to collaborate together and create a hydrogen society.
Thanks, Maya. I want everyone to remember we have a networking activity we're going to do after the wrap of our panel. So make sure you stick around after we hear from Daniel and David with just these closing remarks. But Daniel, to you, best example for collaboration.
Well, I think my comments align with what we've heard already. I want to recall when Aaron Hoskin from NRCan was speaking at the end of his presentation, he was asked a question about low-hanging fruit, and he said international collaboration and keeping the momentum going. And I'd like to add a sort of qualifier to that, which is sure international cooperation, but where I think we really could benefit in Canada from a close collaboration with Japan in particular is on domestic market creation. What are the near-term market opportunities for us to deploy hydrogen in Canada? And maybe these are modest markets to start with, but sustainable, to displace carbon-intense energy. And Japan has been working on this for longer than we have, and for maybe out of strategic necessity. But nevertheless, you have experienced those pain points involved in identifying the opportunities to create a role and a place for clean hydrogen in your economy, in your society. And I think Canada would benefit immensely from understanding the best practices. And we probably have quite a lot to offer to Japan in return as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. David, last word goes to you. Best example of collaboration we can look to.
I would love to see develop a real international trade agreements where hydrogen using vehicles and other technologies come from Japan to Canada, helping increase our demand here. And we actually get investment and support from Japan to actually produce and export low carbon hydrogen to Japan. And we'll put in some fuel cells in there and everything else. But there is some credible opportunity here for the two nations to work together and help us both out. So interested in helping in that any way we can.
Wonderful. Listen, I'm sure all of our audience members will join me in thanking our esteemed panels so very much for spending an hour of your day with us today. To David, to Daniel, Maya, Ishi, Isidore, thank you for being a part of this session. Thank you for your very thoughtful remarks. We hope you'll stick around for the networking activity we have to wrap things up, and we hope we'll see you tomorrow with the next session. Which tomorrow, and so thank you very much. You're free to hop off camera and have a drink of water and take a breath. So thank you for joining us. So to our audience, thank you so much for being with us for the last couple of hours. We have another fun activity coming up, so I do hope you'll stick around. Of course, tomorrow we'll begin the program at the same time as today, and we'll focus on innovation, markets, and trade by tapping into Canada and Japan's hydrogen market potential and showcasing again some of those awesome innovations that are already out there. To join tomorrow, you can use the same link that you did today. As we promised, though, a little bit of networking fun. Tomorrow, we're going to be breaking into two separate networking rooms at the end of the session, one on building our supply chain, one of the key aspects that was raised by our speakers today, and another on core technologies, another topic that came up over and over again with our speakers. So in case you're not able to join for program tomorrow, but you do want to join in the networking fun, we're going to put two links in the chat right away here. And if you copy those links and save them, you can still come around at the end of the day. That's 8:50 p.m. Eastern in Canada, 9:50 a.m. in Japan, to join those networking sessions. Today, before we go about the rest of our evening or our day, we want to do a little bit more of a light touch networking. So before we go, I want to invite you to get involved in the Canada-Japan Hydrogen Networking Board that is going to be shared in the chat here. You're going to click that link that's shared, and it starts with that miro.com link. Click on that link, it'll open in your browser. And this space is specially designed for you to connect with one another. I want to mention that to navigate that board, you can zoom in and out with the plus and minus icon. You can also move around the board, navigate by dragging your way around that file. And there's also arrows you can use to navigate. So you can move around that board. But what we want to encourage you to do is use that to add your contact information if you're comfortable. Share more about the projects that you're working on as you'd like. Of course, again, all languages are welcome. And so to do that, you just double click on a cell in the table on the left and you can type. And then we'd encourage you also to add any areas that you're interested in collaborating on or learning more about in the box on the right. And to do that, you can double click on any of those little virtual post-it notes and fill those in. So I know some of our speakers and myself, I got in there and populated the board earlier today. So we'll just invite you to get in and use that space to share your ideas, share your contact information, share projects that you're working on. I'm just opening the board now and I see it's lots of folks getting active in that space. So that's excellent. Another little Miro tip you can use up at the top of the page. There's a little icon that has an arrow with a couple of lines next to it up top near the middle. if you hover over it, it says show collaborators cursors. If you click that small arrow with the lines, you won't see everybody else's logo flying around the screen. You won't see other people, so it'll just look a little bit less busy if you click that button. If you click it, if it's not on and you click it on, then you'll see everybody flying around the board, which is kind of cool because you can see lots of folks from our group getting in the board and filling it out. So this space will be open for the next few weeks. So we encourage you to fill it out now, but you can come back to it as you wish to reference it and to connect with one another. So with that, it is the end of our formal program today. I want to once again thank all of our wonderful speakers that joined over the last couple of hours. I want to thank all of our attendees for staying with us, for being so active in the chat, engaging with the speakers, engaging with one another. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow, same time, same place. So we'll dig into the next exciting round of speakers and topics. Have a lovely evening or day, depending where you're joining from, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.